Welcome to a brand new series where we dive deep into self-development subjects with valuable guests. Today, we welcome Susie, a dear friend and psychologist, and we're going to talk about self-compassion. Before we get into it, can you tell me why a person who clicked on this video should stick around until the end?
I think for me, self-compassion is at the root of a lot of psychological difficulties, but also because it's central to well-being. So developing self-compassion skills is central to well-being, and I feel like the skills that you learn when you're focusing on self-compassion are sustainable skills that can set you up for well-being in the long term, not just for addressing specific problem areas in your life.
Thank you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
About me. So I have worked in mental health for almost 19 years now, and I have worked across the age span with children, adolescents and adults. My areas of specialism are attachment, trauma, and working with core issues like depression, anxiety and self-esteem.
Okay, thank you. So before we get into it, could you tell us briefly what self-compassion is? And well, you mentioned briefly why it was important, but can you define it in a couple words?
Yeah, so the best way that it's conceptualized, I think that the way that it's agreed upon in research is that there's kind of three fundamental areas to self-compassion. There is self-kindness, which is probably the part that most people can relate to when they're thinking of compassion. There's also the aspect where you recognise that suffering and struggling is common, it's a universal issue. Everyone in the world experiences some kind of struggle or difficulty, and in order to be compassionate to yourself, that's a really key part to recognise that it's normal to suffer. And then the third part is mindfulness, and the reason why that's important is because in order to work on being more compassionate to yourself, you need to actually be aware of how you're suffering. And a lot of people think, well, of course I know I'm suffering, I'm sad or anxious. But actually, a lot of people use defense mechanisms which really make it difficult to really understand how it is you're suffering. So you have the emotion, but you don't really go a step deeper. So mindfulness helps to really get to the root of the suffering, and then to be compassionate towards yourself. But it also helps with stopping yourself getting into a cycle of rumination. So often, and this is something that most people will relate to, if there's a problem or you're anxious about something, you can get into this cycle of really going over thoughts in your head, or one thought will trigger a whole load of other thoughts. And mindfulness can really help with not getting caught up in that cycle as well. So there's kind of those two parts, getting to know yourself better and also being able to take a step back when you're experiencing that cycle.
So having like a distance between...
Exactly, yeah.
And how would you apply mindfulness, like let's say daily, to help to get into self-compassion more?
Well, I think that mindfulness is one of those areas that it received a lot of attention in the last 10, 20 years. And people see it as something that, a bit like when you say, oh, I'm struggling, and people say, oh, why don't you go and take a walk? They're like, well, how is that actually going to help? But with mindfulness, it is really about getting in tune with your thoughts, what's going on in your body, with your feelings, really understanding yourself better. And there are lots of exercises that you can do to enhance the skill. So it's also, it's mind training. That's the way I like to look at it. It's training your mind to be focused on one thing. And in day-to-day life, because we're struggling with so many different responsibilities, you know, you wake up in the morning and you're already thinking, oh, I need to do the shopping, I need to get this bit of work done, I need to do my exercise, I need to make the food. It's really difficult to actually just focus on one thing at a time.
Right.
And when you develop the skills of mindfulness day to day, where you focus on just looking at one thing at a time, that really helps with regulating the way that your brain operates, with your thinking patterns, but also with that then has a knock-on effect on how we regulate emotionally. So it can be as simple as going down to, obviously we're in Hong Kong, so it's going to the beach, putting your feet in the sand and really focusing on how does it feel, what's the temperature, what's the texture. Yeah, really exploring how it feels, and whether it's a nice sensation or not, and really just kind of going over those things. The other really common one is mindfulness of breath, where you try to focus on the sensation of breathing. So I actually prefer focusing on my stomach than on my chest. I find that when I try to focus on my breath and my chest, it actually makes me feel a bit short of breath. So one tip that I would say, if you are just trying to relax and breathe naturally, is to focus on what's going on in your stomach. So the rise and fall of your stomach, feel the air going into your nostrils or into your mouth, whether it's warm, how quickly you're breathing. So all of this is kind of developing your ability to focus on just one thing.
Okay.
If that's difficult, which often it is, because we're so used to having a lot of input, a lot of intrusive thoughts or a lot of noise around us, all you need to do is focus on refocusing. So you get used to every time there's a distracting thought or a sensation or a noise, you remind yourself to refocus back on the breath.
Okay. So like you're reframing every time.
Yeah. And it's frustrating at the start because you're not used to it. But I always think that, and this is why a lot of people stop, because they say, oh, well, I'm not like that. My mind moves at 100 miles an hour. I can't. And it's like, well, nobody can. It takes effort and it takes practice, but it's really worth it. So I would say it's difficult, but so is everything when you first start it.
For sure. Yeah. And it's the consistency that'll make a difference.
Absolutely. But it doesn't need to be for an hour at the start. You know, you can just focus on doing 2 minutes and then gradually increasing the amount that you do. But I think incorporating it into your daily routine at the start is really helpful. And then once you get used to doing it, you can then use it at times when you perhaps feel more stressed, or when you notice that there is a rush of anxiety or an increase in your heartbeat, adrenaline, or that your mind is just a bit scattered. You can then use it at those kind of more difficult, stressful points as a calming mechanism.
Interesting. So it's like a toolkit that you can use.
Exactly.
And we typically hear a lot about self-esteem, self-love, self-care, but how does self-esteem differ from self-compassion?
So self-esteem is a really interesting topic. And for a while, there was a lot of focus on the need to increase self-esteem. And there was a period of time where a lot of psychologists were putting so much emphasis on this. And you can see it in the parenting literature, where there's a real focus on raising your child's self-esteem so that they can go out into the world and feel worthy and good enough. But actually, what researchers are now finding is that you can have high self-esteem, but that is very fragile, because that's an evaluation of yourself. So self-esteem is you making a judgment about how good you are in comparison to others, or compared to the standards that you've set for yourself. So self-esteem is a judgment, whereas self-compassion is meeting ourselves wherever we're at, accepting that we are all flawed, and that again, that's the kind of common humanity part of it, where actually we're all flawed. None of us are perfect, and that's okay. So the difference, I guess, is on the one is rating yourself. Mm-hmm. The other is it doesn't matter because you're good enough regardless. Anything is allowed. All your feelings, failure. I don't really like to use the word failure, but, we can't be successful in every area of our life. That is all very natural, and it's not a reflection on how worthy we are.
Okay, very interesting. I never heard it this way. And so at the same time, without good self-compassion, you can't get to good self-esteem.
There is, I would say, it's really challenging. And what I notice in a lot of my work is that there's a difference between being confident and feeling like you are achieving at things and having good self-esteem. Most people that I meet in a kind of therapeutic environment, or even just in social relationships, friends, family, most people have thought patterns about not being good enough, or this tendency towards self-criticism, and that is even people who you may think have very high self-esteem or who appear to be successful, and that will impact them in some way. So even if to other people they seem like they're doing really well, they are actually experiencing the same challenges as everyone else in terms of the way that they relate to themselves. So self-compassion is necessary to be able to maintain well-being regardless of what is happening in your external environment. Self-esteem is very fragile because a lot of people base their self-esteem on their job or their partner or how much money they have, very superficial things. The problem with those things is that things happen in life. Changes happen, so all those things can be taken away from you, and then you're left with a feeling of being inadequate because all those external things have been removed. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
No, for sure. It makes definitely makes sense. Yeah, it's like some social pressures.
Yeah.
That's why it's interesting. Like self-esteem is it's not really about you.
No.
It's about what you portray. I mean, it's the image you portray to the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting.
And I really struggle to identify many people. This is why I think it's such an interesting concept, because I don't know many people who I would say, yeah, they think they're good enough in every single area of their life. Do you know anyone who feels that way?
I don't think so.
No. So does high self-esteem really exist? Or is it more about feeling confident in different situations or feeling good about this achievement? But regardless, all those things remain very fragile, and we need to develop the skills to know that we are good enough, but also that when things don't go to plan or when we have difficult feelings, we can soothe ourselves. We can return to a state of normal and don't experience kind of the consequences of feeling inadequate.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Can you share like a simple go-to exercise on a daily basis that, in addition to mindfulness, to practice more self-compassion?
Yeah, so I think one of my favourite techniques, and probably the best place to start, is a technique called the best friend technique. Now, what we are very good at is being compassionate towards other people. It's something that is valued in society, being kind and supportive and understanding. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that people actually have a negative view of self-compassion. When it's discussed, you often hear people say, well, isn't it a bit indulgent to be kind to yourself? Or I need to be critical of myself, otherwise I won't get this done, or that's what drives me, that's what motivates me. But all the evidence shows that actually that stuff isn't that helpful, even for motivation. You don't need any of that. Being kind is a better motivator. If you think of it from a parenting perspective, I often say to clients, if your parent said to you the things that you're saying to yourself, like, it's not good enough, you should know better, you've got to work harder at this, you've got to get your anxiety under control, would that be helpful? And people can say, well, no, that wouldn't be helpful, you know, this critical approach. And then when you say, okay, what would you need from your parents? What would be helpful? It's that kind of soothing, supportive, loving message. So the best friend technique is similar to that, in the sense that you are asking yourself, what is it that you need to hear or you would say to someone else in this situation? Because we're better at that and we know that that is more helpful, what is it that you would say to somebody else? So when you notice that you're in a negative thought pattern, or when you're feeling like you're not doing enough, or you're not achieving enough, or you're not where you want to be, rather than go into self-critical mode, what is it that you would say to your best friend or even your child? And that is something that you can constantly check in with yourself. However many negative thoughts that you have, you can keep challenging them just by removing yourself and coming at it from a different person's perspective.
I feel like it's quite hard. Like, it's easier to give compassion to other people than to yourself. Like, you know, when you give advice to someone and you're like, you find yourself in a similar situation, and I feel like it's very hard to apply the same advice sometimes. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I saw something about your brain doesn't use the same part when you're giving advice and when you're trying to help yourself. Is that true? Like, is it physiologically the case?
Well, I think the challenge is more that when you are experiencing emotional reaction to something, so let's think of a scenario. Someone is applying for jobs and they are not hearing back, or they're had an interview, they weren't successful. And so they start telling themselves that they're not good enough, or that they don't have the skill set that's needed, or, you know, that these kind of negative thoughts that you'd have that can feel really debilitating and put you off applying for more jobs, because you're just kind of constantly knocking yourself and feeling like it's out of your reach. So when you give advice to somebody else, you are not experiencing the emotional reaction. So you can approach it from a logical perspective. You can access the parts of your brain that are more logical.
Right.
So in that situation, you would say, you know, keep going. This is a really normal experience. The job market is difficult at the moment. That job may not be right for you.
Yeah.
All these very true things. You know, you can't get every job that you apply for. But when you're experiencing it, you're in the emotion. And when you start telling yourself critical things, you trigger your own threat system. And so that actually stops you from being able to access the reasoning parts of your brain, which is why you adopting the position of giving the advice to somebody else is more helpful, because you'll take yourself out of the emotional experience. But I guess what is important here is that you need to soothe your body first. If you are in that state of threat where you are really thinking, I'm never going to get a job and I'm just not good enough, you will shut down. So you need to really relax and activate the parasympathetic nervous system to be able to soothe. And then you will be able to access the more logical reasoning parts of your brain.
Ah, okay. Yeah, makes sense. How can someone improve their self-worth if they struggle with self-compassion?
So again, it's a day-by-day thing. When you have been telling yourself the same things since childhood. And these patterns and how we relate to ourselves and how we feel about ourselves, these patterns are often formed in childhood. And I'm not saying it's always to do with your parents, but just to do with the feedback that we get from the world around us. If we have a difficult time in school, you know, all of these things, friendships, we are constantly relating to the world around us. So we are being shaped by the feedback that we receive. And the patterns that we develop about whether we are worthy or good enough, they start then. Now, it can feel quite overwhelming to think, well, how do I go from thinking I'm not good enough and having all these thoughts to, you know, being kind to myself? Is that really going to change it? And I think if there's these deeper rooted patterns and you're really struggling to develop self-compassion skills, or it feels even actually if you struggle with the idea of being kind to yourself, that's where it can be helpful to really understand your patterns, where they've arisen. So taking a journal of thoughts that occur in any given situation. So if you feel like an elevation in stress or anxiety, or your mood feels low, really getting in tune with what thoughts come into your mind and noting them down. And then trying to identify patterns. So what you will usually find is that regardless of a scenario, whether it's to do with home, work, health, all of these things, there will be common themes, because these patterns in our brain are so entrenched that they're unconscious almost a lot of the time, and we have to bring them to the surface. We have to be aware of them, and then we can start to challenge them. Now, if you chip away at them day by day, if you challenge those thoughts at the time, it begins to create the changes in your brain. It encourages psychological flexibility, and you can begin to create new pathways that are kinder, more compassionate, and you can begin to see yourself in a different way. Now, it might be a stretch to go from low self-worth to feeling like you deserve all of the things in life. Again, that's not what self-compassion is about. Self-compassion is about being more reasonable, being more nurturing, being soothing, and recognizing that these thought patterns are a part of life, but you can calm yourself down, you can create new pathways, you can look at things from a different perspective, and it's a commitment. I think self-compassion, you know, it's not just a concept, it's an active process where you are committing to relieving your own suffering. So if you feel that you have low self-worth, if you notice that you're down on yourself and really self-critical, it is committing to changing those patterns of thought. And that may take time, but really, you know, as we said before, talking about all the external stuff, that can be taken away from you. And all that you're left with is how you feel about yourself. Yeah. And knowing that you're good enough, flawed but good enough, will put you in a good place to be able to deal with life challenges as they arise. But you don't have to love yourself. You just have to be, as in, you have to be kind to yourself, but you don't have to think, I'm the most amazing person on earth.
Right.
That's unrealistic.
So just like a little minimum of kindness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Slowly chipping away and holding yourself accountable for showing yourself the same grace that you give to other people.
And when you mentioned the neural pathways, it's linked to neuroplasticity, right? The fact that we can remodel our brain at any time.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
And that is really what therapeutic work is all about. Long-term therapeutic work is repeatedly, you know, if you look at toddlers, you repeat the same thing over and over again to try to develop a pathway to kind of shape them or mold them into certain behaviours or even like a sense of safety or learning. You know, everything is repetition. And it's the same in adult life. If we repeat and repeat and repeat, eventually we will strengthen new pathways and new ways of looking at things.
I mean, it's pretty reassuring to hear too.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's hard work, and I think that's what's difficult, because it's kind of a lifelong commitment to a way of being. It's not okay, I'll do this for 4 weeks and then all my negative feelings about myself will be resolved.
Yeah.
That's not the way it works. Those thoughts will pop back up.
Right. It's a whole process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And then when that happens, the tendency is for people to feel frustrated. Why isn't it working? Why can't I get to grips with this? More self-compassion's needed because it's hard.
And what are the long-term benefits of practicing self-compassion?
I mean, if you look at the research, there is just endless research on life satisfaction, well-being, on your motivation, resilience, courage. It actually, if you kind of name anxiety, depression, all of those things, if you name one area that you think that people might typically access therapeutic support for, and you look at the research on the impact of self-compassion on those areas, you will find that there are significant improvements in all those areas. And I think that it also has a physiological benefits. So being compassionate to yourself can soothe your nervous system. And the other thing that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to is needing to turn to other people for support and reassurance, and really relying on others to feel okay in situations. Whereas when we can develop self-compassion, of course we always need relationships. You know, being supported by other people is kind of what life is all about. But it's not a prerequisite. You can soothe yourself, you can meet your own needs. So in areas where you're really struggling, you don't need to wait for somebody else to come in and help you to see things in a different way.
Right.
You develop those skills yourself. So I guess you become more self-sufficient in soothing, and then that has a knock-on effect across the board.
Yeah, because if you can help yourself first, you can help others.
Absolutely. This is actually something that people talk about a lot in Buddhist counselling. The essence of Buddhism is all about compassion, and there is a strong focus on self-compassion as well. But one thing that I've heard people talk about a lot is I really don't want to be, it is that barrier. I don't want to be compassionate to myself. I see it as like wallowing or self-indulgent. You can help people to buy into it by saying, actually, if you want to be able to help other people, the best way to do that is to help yourself first and to soothe yourself first. That will bring out the best version of yourself, and it will make you more available to be able to hold space for other people.
And it's also about love as well, right? Like typically it's believed and said that if you don't love yourself fully before you love someone else, it'll be challenging. So it kind of is similar, right?
I think that the reason why that is so important, that's all to do with attachment. And self-compassion and attachment are very closely linked because, again, our beliefs about our selves are linked to our attachment experiences, and how we relate to other people or how other people have related to us. So we can develop really unhealthy views about ourselves, which can play out in relationships.
Right.
And by having an awareness of your own triggers, your own default thinking patterns, you can begin to break negative cycles within relationships. So I don't think you have to think, again, you don't have to love yourself in the same way that you'd love a partner,
Yeah.
but you have to be aware enough that you sometimes the way that you react to things is actually to do with your feelings about you rather than another person's feelings about you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the emphasis should lie, on developing, again, acceptance of yourself, compassion towards yourself, not feeling that everything is a threat.
Right.
And that will help you in your relationships with other people.
Do you have any real life examples, how self-compassion significantly changed someone's view or on things or their life?
I mean, I incorporate it into a lot of the therapeutic work that I do, because I do think it is about creating that sustainable change. So when I think back to so many of my clients, I can see how their understanding of their own patterns and then putting an emphasis on shifting those patterns was beneficial and helped them to change the way that they approached life, work, and home life. So I'm thinking there's one client I had who had really struggled with postnatal anxiety, and she had been very high up in her work prior to going on maternity leave, and then she'd had 2 children in quite quick succession. And there was some challenges in childhood. We explored those, and it was clear that there had been, like most families, there were some issues and difficulties that had contributed to her thought patterns and her feelings about herself. But basically, she'd had her second child, and she was really struggling with managing the 2 children, but also wanting to go back to work, but then feeling that guilty. I think a lot of mothers will be able to relate to this, this constant pull between being at work or being at home, or wanting some time for yourself and feeling like you're not quite good enough in every area. And a really intelligent woman who had had therapy previously, but she was really struggling to apply the strategies that she'd learnt previously. So the things that had helped when she had experienced anxiety in her early 20s were no longer helping, and that was contributing to this feeling of frustration. And I think the key with her was developing, it's not always about treating symptoms and about managing symptoms. Sometimes it's about really changing the root causes or the patterns, the way that we treat ourselves, and that changes everything. So rather than being reliant on her husband for reassuring her or telling her that she was good enough or all these things, that was creating a bit of tension as well, because she felt like she wasn't getting her needs met. She would really worked hard on learning about her patterns of thought and behaviour, and committed to changing her relationship with feelings, allowing them, which is something she had never done. And I think that's something we haven't addressed, actually. It's really hard for people to know. It's like, okay, well, if I accept that I have this feeling, how do I deal with it? How do I make it go away? It's almost like we believe that we have to avoid it, we have to distract, or have someone else come and make us feel better, because what else do we do with it? But she really committed to a different way, to kind of accepting the feelings, exploring them, and talking to herself in a different way, as well as including the self-care. And that's where self-care does come in. It's not the same as compassion. Giving yourself a bubble bath doesn't equate to being compassionate. However, it is saying, you deserve this, you deserve to be soothed, you need these things. So it is
it's
really
a stepping stone.
Yeah, it's a really important part of it. And she did all of these things. She worked on her mindfulness. She created, somehow, it's pretty miraculous given that she had 2 young children, created space to be able to develop those skills. And in 10 weeks, her mood and anxiety symptoms had reduced from clinical significance, which is a very kind of therapeutic way of looking at things. But basically, she felt a dramatic improvement. And what's changed is that she now accepts that these themes, these patterns will arise in the future. That's almost inevitable in a way, but she feels equipped to be able to deal with them. And she knows that she has it in her to be able to deal with the emotional reaction, but also respond to herself in a different way.
That's huge. That's where, as you say, and it's also like having the awareness, but then also having the actions that will help.
And it's not, the same things don't work for everyone, the same approaches don't work for everyone. So it's really about tailoring your, experimenting with different ideas and then seeing what works for you. But as long as you are focusing on this, allowing the feelings, accepting your experience, working on being non-judgmental, almost just creating a therapeutic environment for yourself, you will observe changes.
That's amazing. And it also makes me think of, personally, if I have to think of a moment where I really applied self-compassion for the first time, really, was when I first started having OCD, and I first knew it was OCD. Just having the awareness that it was a disorder and it wasn't me. I learned how to really see it differently and to find a distance. And those thoughts still come today, but I have this huge toolkit now that I didn't have 10 years ago.
That's it. And I think that is something that's so helpful, is to, the psychoeducation part of therapy is really helpful because it does do just that. It normalizes it. And that's the second part of self-compassion that I was talking about, that kind of common humanity, that suffering is common to everyone. And while for you, challenges may have manifested as OCD behaviours, for other people it may manifest in a different way, but at the core of it, it's the same thing. And once you stop being critical of yourself and seeing it as, I've got a disorder, there's something wrong with me, and you start to look at it as this is a common problem, or this is something that a lot of people struggle with, I can work on this, there are ways that I can support myself. It completely changes your approach to it.
Completely. How do perfectionists apply self-compassion?
It is hard for perfectionists because that is almost a strategy that has been developed. It's almost a defense mechanism. It's a coping mechanism to be able to manage your feelings about yourself. So needing to complete everything perfectly, needing to meet certain standards is associated actually with what we were talking about in terms of self-esteem. You feel like your worth is based on achievement and doing things in a certain way. And that is really problematic. I think particularly I notice it with adolescents in Hong Kong, because there is, it's such a competitive environment, schooling here, there is this need to achieve. And if you don't achieve, then sometimes actually overtly told that you're not good enough. But that's the feeling, and it's regardless of parents' feelings actually and parents' views. It's a culture, and self-compassion is most important for perfectionists and self-critical people. It is the exact opposite of perfectionism and self-criticism. It is recognizing that you deserve peace, you deserve to be calm and to have good mental health and well-being, and that is the priority above achievement.
Right.
But if you've developed this pattern of being, of needing that, it's really hard to let go of that. And I think sometimes it might need a bit of external support, or it's just chipping away at it slowly. Again, getting insight into your own patterns of thought and why you have developed this way of being. What is it? What does it mean to you if you don't do that thing perfectly? What does it mean to you if you're not the best or you don't get first place? And then thinking, okay, so an example might be, well, I'm a failure. Well, what would that mean if you're a failure? And then usually, well, either my parents might not be proud or I'm not good enough. It usually comes back to feelings of being good enough or lovable, or and then it's about recognizing that you are suffering because of the way that you are talking to yourself, that thought process is not actually reflective of reality. That's something that you've created, and not being too attached to our belief systems. And again, it's helpful to have somebody else's perspective, because often perfectionists will say, well, I don't expect that of other people. It's only me. It's only me who needs to do that. But you need to recognise the impact that that's having on you. Once you recognise that you're suffering as a result of this, then it's about gradually working on changing those expectations and standards.
And it must be hard for teenagers to have that mental flexibility.
It is, but it can be as simple as, what I like to do actually with teenagers is to just do a bit of an experiment. So to say, okay, being compassionate might be, rather than studying for 5 hours in an evening, it's like, okay, you're going to do 3 hours just tonight. You don't have to commit to doing it forever. You're going to do 3 hours, and then you're going to do an hour of something for yourself, and then you're going to get an early night. And then I want you to report back and tell me how that felt. Obviously, you give them the tools to be able to deal with this level of stress, and it's not about, God forbid, I tell them not to hand in their work or whatever, but, so set them up with a behavioural experiment so they're not committing to lifelong change at this point.
Right.
And what they will often find is that they woke up feeling better, more alert, they got all their work done, and they were able to have a positive time. So then you gradually say, okay, well, if it worked that day, maybe you could do that on Friday as well. So it gradually becomes a different way of being, and they recognise that lessening their expectations of themselves or the amount of time that they're consumed by work doesn't actually affect their performance. It increases it, it enhances it, and it helps them to feel better.
Wow. Yeah, so through action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think teenagers particularly like a little bit of, they like behavioural experiments. They need to learn it for themselves. Why are they going to trust me to say, actually, you just need to change what you do and do it this way? It's about recognising the benefits of trying something new. And I guess that can equally work with adults as well. Just saying, do you know what, today I'm going to just try it.
Yeah. Taking baby steps every day.
And if it worked, which it will, then great. If it doesn't, then I suspect that there's these barriers, we become very attached to ways of being, and there's often limiting beliefs that we have that keep us trapped in unhelpful patterns. Sometimes those need to be broken down to enable us to do the helpful things.
How do you think, because you spoke about mindfulness earlier, how can practicing, when I say practicing, is like applying self-compassion, how can it significantly reduce anxiety?
So depending on, there's different approaches and theories about anxiety. But generally, there is an activation that was common to all theories, is that it's recognised that there's an activation of our threat system. Now, that is fired, that we are constantly activating our own threat system through our thoughts. And what we don't realise is that we can have an initial trigger in our environment that might initially activate it, but it's our thoughts that maintain anxiety. So by committing to reducing our own suffering, by committing to being supportive instead of critical, by committing to regulating, self-soothing, stopping the cycles of rumination, all of these things that self-compassion demands of us, it's actually going to stop us from either activating our own threat system by criticising. It's probably what happens most, you know, where you say, oh, I should be doing this, I must be doing that. Immediately we feel like that wave of, and it spirals. And then we'll have another thought and that maintains it. So by committing to changing those cycles, and being compassionate instead, we will stop activating our threat system or maintaining the anxiety once it arises. But there's also another aspect of anxiety or worry in general, which is, first of all, overestimating the threat because of the thoughts we come up with, but also underestimating our ability to cope. Now, if we are working on self-compassion and allowing feelings, then we know that we can work with any feeling that arises. We are comfortable that in knowing that we can be in a difficult situation and we have the tools that we need to be able to deal with it. So again, it's kind of by practicing it, you become more confident that you can cope with anything. So the worry will reduce.
And then if you can deal with anxiety, you can deal with anything.
I think so. I think anxiety is at the root of most things, as is, well, I mean, we're very complicated, aren't we? But, you know, as I said, this kind of, these judgments about ourselves, these self-critical narratives or expectations for ourselves, and the subsequent anxiety, you see that as a common thread in most people you meet, and impacts people in different ways. It manifests as different disorders or challenges, but yeah, it's common to everyone.
Wow. That's a really nice way to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Susie.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.